Let me ask you something straight. Right now, in America, there are millions of people who say that the Hebrew Israelites of the Bible were not who history books tell us they were. And every single day, someone fires back with the same response. You got that from the King James Bible. Your ancestors were given that identity by slaveholders. It was never really yours. That argument sounds strong. It sounds logical. And for a long time, it was hard to counter with hard documentation. Until you find Richard Jobson. Because in 1623, before the transatlantic slave trade reached full scale, before missionary schools, before a single enslaved African in America had been handed a Bible and told who the Israelites were, an English merchant sailed up the Gambia River in West Africa. He worked for a London trading company. His job was profit, not theology. He had no reason to flatter the people he encountered, no reason to validate their identity, and absolutely no reason to lie in their favor. And yet, in his published book, he wrote that the people he found along that river were circumcised, observed the Sabbath, refused to eat pork, wore fringed garments on their clothing, and organized themselves into tribal groupings whose names matched the 12 tribes of Israel. He named every tribe. In 1623, in West Africa. So here's the question that is going to drive every minute of this video. If an English merchant in 1623 found them keeping the Sabbath in West Africa, what does that make them? Stay with me, because this document is real. This man was real, and what he wrote changes the entire conversation. The man's name was Richard Jobson. And before we get into what he found, we need to understand who he was, because the identity of the witness is everything. Jobson was not a priest, he was not a missionary, he was not a theologian with an agenda to prove a biblical theory. He was a commercial agent working on behalf of the Company of Adventurers of London, an English trading corporation that had been chartered to explore and exploit commercial opportunities along the Gambia River in West Africa. His mission was straightforward: travel upriver, find the gold trade, and report back to the investors who were funding the operation. That is the man who wrote this document. In 1623, when he returned to England, he published his findings under the title The Golden Trade, or A Discovery of the River Gambra and the Golden Trade of the Ethiopians. It was a commercial travel narrative, part expedition report, part intelligence document for London merchants who wanted to know whether the Gambia River route was worth backing financially. Now here is why the identity of the witness matters so much. In historical analysis, there is a category of testimony called hostile witness evidence. A hostile witness is someone who, by all logic and interest, should not be supporting a particular claim, but who records it anyway, because they saw it with their own eyes. Hostile witness testimony is considered among the most credible forms of historical evidence, precisely because the witness has nothing to gain and often something to lose by telling the truth. Richard Jobson was a hostile witness. He was a colonial commercial agent operating within a system that depended on diminishing and exploiting the people of West Africa. He had no theological motivation to document Hebrew Israelite practices among the people he encountered. He had no political reason to validate their identity. And yet, in the middle of a commercial report written for London investors, he described in specific detail a people whose entire way of life aligned with the Hebrew covenant tradition. That is not a man who is trying to prove a point. That is a man who saw something he could not ignore, and he wrote it down. Drop a comment right now and tell me, had you ever heard the name Richard Jobson before this video? Because I want to know how many people this information has reached and how many are hearing it for the first time. Let us go inside the testimony itself, because the details are what make this document extraordinary. The first thing Jobson documented was circumcision. The men he encountered along the Gambia River practiced circumcision as a religious custom. Now, this alone is not definitive. Circumcision exists in multiple cultural contexts across Africa. But it is significant as the first marker in a larger pattern, because circumcision in the Hebrew tradition is not merely a physical practice, it is a covenant sign. Genesis chapter 17 describes it as the mark of the agreement between the Creator and the descendants of Abraham. It is the entry point into the covenant lineage, and these people were keeping it. The second thing Jobson documented was Sabbath observance. This is where the testimony begins to carry serious weight. He noted that the people observed a specific day of rest, a day set apart from labor, commerce, and ordinary activity, a sacred pause in their weekly rhythm. In 1623, on the banks of the Gambia River, in the interior of West Africa. Now think carefully about what that means. The Sabbath is not a casual cultural habit. It is a covenant command embedded in the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5. It is described in Exodus chapter 31 as a sign between the Creator and His people throughout all their generations. You do not accidentally keep the Sabbath. You do not stumble into it. It is a deliberate, theologically loaded practice that marks a specific covenant identity, and these people were keeping it before any European missionary had penetrated deeply enough into the interior to have influenced them. The fourth observation is one that many people overlook, but it is perhaps the most specific of all. Jobson noted that the people wore fringes on the borders of their clothing. This is not a generic African textile tradition. The wearing of fringes, known in the Hebrew tradition as tzitzit, is a direct command found in Numbers chapter 15 and Deuteronomy chapter 22. The command is explicit: make fringes on the borders of your garments as a reminder of the commandments of the Most High. This is a practice so specific, so theologically intentional, that its presence in Jobson's account cannot be explained away as coincidence or cultural overlap. And the fifth observation, the one that ties everything together, was the tribal structure. Jobson documented that the people were not organized as a single undifferentiated group. They were organized into distinct tribal groupings, and when he wrote down the names of those groupings, the names corresponded to the 12 tribes of Israel. 5 distinct markers, all documented by one hostile commercial witness, all in 1623, all in West Africa. Here is the question I want you to wrestle with and leave in the comments. If even 2 or 3 of these 5 markers showed up in a single account, historians would call it significant. All 5 together? What do you call that? Let us spend a moment on the tribal dimension specifically, because this is the part of Jobson's testimony that historians have been slowest to engage with seriously. When Jobson traveled the Gambia River, he was not moving through a land of nameless, undifferentiated peoples. He was entering a world of structured societies with deep genealogical memory. And one of the things he recorded, as part of his commercial intelligence, just trying to understand who he was dealing with, was the names of the tribal groupings he encountered. The 12 tribes of Israel, as recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures, are the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, the patriarch also called Israel. Their names are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. These names are not generic Semitic words. They are specific genealogical identifiers tied to a specific covenantal lineage. They are the organizational backbone of the entire Hebrew national structure as described in the Torah, the historical books, and the prophetic literature. Now, Jobson was writing phonetically, transcribing names as he heard them spoken in languages he was not fully fluent in, through interpreters whose accuracy varied. So we should not expect perfect alphabetical matches. What we should look for, and what the historical record provides, is structural correspondence, the pattern of a 12-tribe system, the specific sounds and roots of the tribal names, the social roles associated with each grouping. And what Jobson documented, when placed alongside the roster of the 12 tribes, reflects not a surface-level resemblance, but a deep structural alignment. A people who had organized their entire social world, their kinship obligations, their territorial divisions, their spiritual responsibilities, along a framework that mirrors the ancient Israelite tribal system at every significant point. This is not the kind of thing that happens by accident. Social structures this specific, genealogical memories this detailed, do not emerge independently from thin air. They are inherited, they are carried, they are transmitted through generations with deliberate intention because they matter to the people who hold them. Now we need to talk about time. Because if you have been listening carefully, you already sense why the date of 1623 is the single most important fact in this entire documentary. The argument that critics have long used against the Black Hebrew Israelite movement rests heavily on timing. The argument says enslaved Africans encountered the Hebrew scriptures through their slaveholders, read the story of bondage and liberation in Egypt, and adopted the Israelite identity because it gave their suffering meaning and their resistance a theological framework. It is argued that the identification is therefore a product of the slave experience in America, a spiritual adaptation, powerful and understandable, but ultimately derived from a text handed to them by their oppressors. This is a serious argument, and it has shaped how generations of scholars have approached the question of African American religious identity. But Richard Jobson's testimony breaks that argument's foundation. The transatlantic slave trade began in the mid-1500s with Portuguese operations, but the mass deportation of West Africans to the Americas, the catastrophic industrial-scale operation that would empty entire coastlines and scatter millions across the Atlantic, did not reach its full destructive momentum until the mid to late 17th century and through the 18th century. Jobson arrived on the Gambia River in 1623. He is documenting the people of that region before the machinery of mass enslavement had fully processed them. He is looking at a population that had not yet been subjected to the forced religious conversion, the deliberate cultural erasure, and the systematic replacement of identity that the slave system would later impose. And what he found was a people already keeping the Sabbath, already practicing circumcision, already observing the dietary laws, already wearing the fringed garments, already organized into 12 tribal groupings with names matching the covenant lineage. Before the ships, before the Bible was handed to them, before anyone told them who they were, they already knew. And a commercial Englishman wrote it down because he could not pretend he had not seen it. This changes the conversation from theology to history, from interpretation to documentation, from a community claiming an identity to a colonial record confirming one. Here is the part of this story that should make you uncomfortable. The Golden Trade is not a lost document. It has been cataloged in English libraries since 1623. It has been referenced by historians studying early English commercial activity in West Africa. It is a real, accessible, verifiable piece of primary source documentation. And yet, the specific content of what Jobson observed, The Sabbath, the circumcision, the dietary laws, the fringed garments, the tribal names, has been consistently treated as incidental detail in mainstream historical discourse, a curiosity, a footnote, something colorful that a colonial merchant mentioned in passing, not something that bears serious evidential weight on one of the most contested questions in African and African American history. We should ask ourselves honestly why that is. The institutions that have historically decided what counts as significant historical evidence, the universities, the publishing houses, the learned societies, the national archives, were themselves products of the same colonial world that produced Richard Jobson. They were not neutral arbiters of truth. They operated within a set of assumptions about Africa and African peoples that made certain kinds of evidence difficult to take seriously. Evidence that complicated the colonial narrative, evidence that placed African peoples inside the stream of ancient covenant history rather than outside it. When Jobson's specific observations are taken seriously, when you sit with the weight of 5 independent Hebrew Israelite markers documented by a hostile witness in 1623, the standard colonial narrative about African religious and cultural identity does not hold. It requires a different explanation, a more honest one. And that honest explanation begins with acknowledging that this evidence exists, that it has always existed, and that the silence around it has been doing a great deal of historical work on behalf of a story that was never entirely true. Leave a comment. Tell me, do you think this evidence has been deliberately overlooked, or do you think it is simply a matter of what gets prioritized in mainstream historical education? Because that is a real debate worth having. So let us come back to the question. If an English merchant in 1623 found them keeping the Sabbath in West Africa, what does that make them? Let the evidence answer directly. Circumcision, the covenant mark of Abraham, documented on the Gambia River in 1623. Sabbath observance, the covenant sign of Exodus 31, documented on the Gambia River in 1623. Refusal to eat pork, the dietary law of Leviticus 11, documented on the Gambia River in 1623. Fringed garments, the commandment of Numbers 15, documented on the Gambia River in 1623. 12 tribal groupings with names matching the covenant lineage, documented on the Gambia River in 1623. All of this before the mass deportations, before the forced conversions, before the Bible was handed to enslaved people as a tool of control, before anyone in chains in Virginia or South Carolina or Jamaica was told who the Israelites were. The people who would later be taken on those ships were already living as Hebrew Israelites. Their identity was not adopted from a text given to them by their oppressors. It was an original, documented, witnessed identity that the machinery of slavery tried to erase, and that 400 years later, a colonial merchant's published book refuses to let stay buried. For the African American community watching this, that is not a small thing. That is the difference between a community that borrowed an identity in suffering and a community that was reclaiming one that was always theirs. And for anyone still skeptical, the challenge is straightforward. Read The Golden Trade. It has been sitting there since 1623. The testimony is in Job's own words. The document is real. The man was there, and he wrote it down. History does not always survive, but sometimes it does, in the most unlikely places. In a commercial report written by an English merchant who was trying to find gold and found something that gold cannot buy. He found a people. He saw who they were, and he told the truth about it without ever understanding what the truth would mean 400 years later. Now you know it too. Share this video, because the people who need to hear this are not going to find it by accident.